The courtroom was a cathedral of silence, every cough suppressed, every shifting chair magnified like thunder in the air. Rows of spectators leaned forward in anticipation, phones hidden but hearts pounding, because everyone knew this wasn't going to be an ordinary proceeding. At the front, under the heavy shadows of the chamber lights, Clarence Thomas sat with his usual air of untouchable confidence, lips curled into that faint smirk that always seemed to say, "I am beyond consequence." He tapped a finger against the armrest slowly, like a judge of fate itself. The gallery watched, uneasy, as if a predator had just bared its teeth. To most, the man looked unshakable, a towering figure insulated by decades of power. To others, he looked exactly like what America's conscience had warned against, arrogance hardened into stone. And then, like a scene torn from a film reel, Tom Cruise rose from his seat, not with the exaggerated energy of his on-screen characters, but with a controlled steadiness that carried more weight than shouting ever could. The murmurs cut short. Even Thomas, still smirking, raised his eyes. Cruise locked his gaze on the justice, and for a long breath said nothing. The silence turned unbearable. The entire chamber leaned into the pause, drawn like moths to a flame they couldn't yet see. Then the words came, sharp and unflinching. "You've hidden behind that bench long enough. Today, you answer not with rulings, not with power, but with truth." A ripple ran through the room, gasps, stifled whispers, a sudden intake of breath that seemed to suck the oxygen away. This was not the polite script anyone had expected. This was a man daring to puncture the veil around a Supreme Court justice, live, on record, in front of a nation watching. Thomas's smirk twitched, but he held it, unwilling to grant even a flicker of reaction. Yet the shift in the gallery was undeniable. For the first time, the weight of his title seemed smaller than the words that had just been spoken against him. Tom's voice, calm but commanding, hung in the air like a verdict still being written. And though no one knew it yet, the next words, the next exchanges, would not just fill the court record. They would ignite a moment that would be replayed, dissected, and remembered for years to come. But what followed would shake the very foundations of the room. The words hung in the air like a challenge carved in stone, echoing through the chamber long after Tom Cruise had spoken them. For a moment, time itself seemed to hesitate, caught between the authority of the bench and the audacity of the man who dared to pierce it. But this was no longer just a tense courtroom exchange, it was the ignition of something bigger, something already rippling far beyond the oak-paneled walls. Outside the courthouse, satellite trucks lined the streets, news anchors shuffled their notes, voices trembling with the anticipation of a live broadcast that was already trending across every network. The banner at the bottom of the screen screamed, "Cruise confronts Thomas live." On social media, hashtags exploded with each passing second. Hashtag Cruise vs. Thomas. Hashtag Truth on Trial. Hashtag America Watching. The digital heartbeat of the nation pulsed in real time, as millions leaned into their screens, unwilling to blink. Why did this matter so much? Because for years, Americans had grown weary of feeling invisible, of watching powerful men sit untouched behind mahogany desks while ordinary people carried the weight of decisions they never had a voice in. Clarence Thomas had become the symbol of that untouchable power, aloof, shielded, and dismissive of the very people his role demanded he serve. Tom Cruise, in contrast, represented something strikingly different. He wasn't a lawyer. He wasn't a politician. He was an artist, a performer, a man whose entire life had been defined by showing truth through story. In stepping into that chamber, he blurred the line between cinema and reality, reminding America that sometimes it takes an outsider, someone unafraid of losing, to reveal the cracks in an empire. This wasn't Hollywood fiction. This was a mirror, tilted back at the system itself. And that's why the stakes towered so high. Every eye trained on that room wasn't just watching to see whether Thomas would swat Cruise away with judicial arrogance, or whether Cruise would stumble in overreach. They were watching because deep down, they recognized the confrontation as something primal, the authenticity of an unfiltered voice colliding with the carefully guarded fortress of power. Inside the chamber, the tension thickened. Some spectators shifted nervously, others gripped the wooden benches with white knuckles, as though bracing for an earthquake. Every micro-expression from Thomas, every tilt of his head, every narrowed glance was being captured, dissected, magnified by cameras hungry for the slightest crack in his facade. And yet, there was a strange reversal unfolding. The more Thomas clung to his smirk, the more the nation began to see it not as strength but as brittleness. Meanwhile, Cruise's stillness radiated control. His calm demeanor spoke to every immigrant who had been told to sit down and be quiet, every working parent who had been dismissed by a boss, every young person who had ever felt powerless against the machinery of authority. The energy shifted. Commentators online began writing in real time. "This isn't just a trial, it's a reckoning. Thomas doesn't realize he's on the stage now. not the bench. Cruise is channeling the voice of all of us. And as that perception spread, the courtroom ceased to feel like a sealed-off chamber of law. It became a national theater, a place where the masks of authority could finally crack under the weight of truth. The stakes were no longer about whether one man could verbally spar with another. The stakes had swelled to something heavier, something historic, whether dignity and truth could still stand a chance against entrenched arrogance and corruption. And as the cameras zoomed in, America realized this wasn't just about two men, it was about the soul of the country. For decades, Clarence Thomas had sat high above the fray, his name synonymous with the kind of power that felt untouchable. To some, he was a steady hand in the judiciary. To many more, he was the embodiment of how distance from ordinary life calcifies into arrogance. The courtroom that day was not the first time he'd been accused of being aloof, nor the first time whispers of corruption had trailed him like a shadow, but it was the first time the nation seemed ready to confront the image head-on. Thomas's story was often framed as one of resilience, a rise from poverty in Pinpoint, Georgia, to the highest court in the land. And yet, what should have been an inspiring testament to perseverance had, over the years, hardened into something else entirely. The man who once carried the weight of humble beginnings now seemed to wield it like a shield, deflecting criticism with a rehearsed detachment. When confronted about conflicts of interest or questioned about the closeness of his ties to wealthy benefactors, his response was not outrage, nor contrition, it was silence. The kind of silence that suggested not reflection, but dismissal. His demeanor in public was famously cold. Rarely speaking from the bench, he cultivated the aura of a man above debate, above explanation, above the messy transparency that democracy demands. Supporters called it restraint, critics saw it as contempt. He faced rejection after rejection, told he wasn't right for this role, not enough for that one. Yet he refused to disappear. He studied relentlessly, trained obsessively, dissected scripts until they bled meaning. Each no became fuel, every closed door another reason to push harder. When risky business finally cracked open the door, he didn't treat it as luck. He treated it as proof that preparation, endurance, and a refusal to surrender could bend fate itself. And as his career climbed, so did his resolve to carry that work ethic everywhere he went. While others coasted, Tom doubled down. He trained for roles with military precision, learning every skill, performing his own stunts, pushing his body to the limit, not for vanity, but because he believed truth demanded sacrifice. Audiences felt it. They saw in his performances not just a star, but a man who was willing to risk himself for authenticity. But Cruise's journey wasn't just about stardom. Beneath the action sequences and blockbuster glitz was a man who consistently chose to stand beside people others ignored. Stories from set after set painted the same picture. Tom defending crew members against mistreatment, insisting that assistants and technicians be respected, taking time to speak to fans as equals, not inconveniences. He carried himself like someone who remembered what it felt like to be overlooked and refused to pass that feeling on to others. There were moments when the cameras weren't rolling that revealed even more. On productions where conditions were brutal, he became the one to rally morale. When young actors faltered under pressure, he took them aside, steadied them, reminded them they belonged. For him, success was never just about personal gain, it was about service, about lifting others while climbing himself. That ethos of service mirrored something deeper, something that connected him to the millions now watching in that courtroom showdown. Immigrants who left everything behind to build a life in a strange land. Families who sacrificed silently so their children could have a chance. Communities that carried dignity in the face of dismissal. Tom's story resonated because it was, at its core, the story of resilience against odds that were never fair. Hollywood had given him a platform, but what it had also given him was a sharp view of arrogance. He had seen actors lose themselves in vanity, executives treat others as disposable, elites wielding their privilege like a weapon, and he had chosen, again and again, not to become that. Instead, he wore his discipline like armor, and his humility like a compass. And now, in this courtroom, every thread of that life, the rejection, the persistence, the instinct to protect the vulnerable wove together into something larger. He wasn't just an actor confronting a justice. He was a man carrying the weight of every underdog who had been silenced, every dreamer who had been told to sit down, every worker who had been reminded they weren't powerful enough to speak. The irony was not lost on anyone. Here was Tom Cruise, whose life had been defined by fictional performances of truth and justice, standing in a real arena where truth and justice were on trial. But the difference was staggering. On set, when the director called "cut," the lights dimmed, and the audience applauded, the stakes evaporated into fiction. Here, the stakes were flesh and blood, dignity and democracy. No second takes, no safety nets. And yet Tom carried no fear. Because unlike Clarence Thomas, whose smirk was born of insulation, Tom's calm came from exposure, years of staring rejection in the eye, years of pushing past doubt, years of choosing discipline when the world offered an easier exit. His composure wasn't a mask, it was the product of scars. As he sat in that chamber, facing down a man who had come to embody everything distant and arrogant about American power, Cruise wasn't playing a role. He was fulfilling a trajectory that had been building all along. The outsider turned champion, the disciplined dreamer turned truth-teller, the man who had never stopped preparing for moments that seemed impossible. The nation saw it. The spectators felt it. Every camera captured the image of a man who was not rattled, not cowed, not playing dress-up with authority. He was standing in his own truth. And when Tom finally stood, the courtroom had no idea it was about to witness the performance of a lifetime, except this time, it wasn't acting. The silence cracked when Clarence Thomas finally leaned forward, his voice low but edged with disdain. "Mr. Cruise," he began, his tone wrapping the words in condescension. "This is not a movie set. This is not a stage for theatrics. You do not dictate the order of justice here." The smirk returned, faint but unmistakable, as if every syllable was a dismissal. The gallery stirred, some shifting uncomfortably, others clutching the arms of their seats as though they were watching not just a man speak, but an institution flex its authority. For years, Thomas had wielded that same tone to silence critics, to remind challengers of their place. It had worked before. Why wouldn't it now? Tom didn't flinch. His posture remained upright, his eyes steady. He let the words wash over him like waves crashing against rock. To everyone watching, his stillness was louder than any rebuttal. Thomas continued, sharpening his attack. "You are here because you've mistaken fame for wisdom, spectacle for truth. Do not confuse applause with legitimacy. The law does not bend to celebrity." Each phrase was a dagger, carefully aimed to wound, to belittle, to remind Cruise that no matter how many millions cheered him on screens, inside this chamber, he was a trespasser. Gasps fluttered through the room. Cameras caught every flicker of Thomas's face, the arched brow, the narrowed eyes, the deliberate cadence. For a moment, the justice seemed unshakable, as though decades of armor made him invincible to confrontation. And yet, as Thomas spoke, the contrast only grew sharper. His words carried power, but they also carried something else, the sour aftertaste of arrogance. Viewers at home felt it instantly. Online, the reaction was electric. "He's not answering, he's belittling. Thomas is attacking Cruise, not the argument. This feels like power lashing out." Inside the chamber, the tension grew unbearable. Every pause in Thomas's speech stretched like wire about to snap. When he said, "History will remember who speaks out of turn today," the gallery froze, aware that this wasn't just about one man being scolded. It was about a system reminding everyone of their place. Still, Tom refused to rise to the bait. His calm became almost defiant, his silence deliberate. It unnerved Thomas, who pressed harder, voice rising a notch. "You claim to speak for truth, for dignity, but who appointed you the arbiter of either? Where were you when this court carried the burden of the nation's law? You were making movies, chasing fame, profiting from spectacle." The justice leaned back, letting his words echo, confident he had drawn blood. His smirk widened just slightly, the look of a man who believed he had reasserted dominance. The courtroom seemed to tilt toward him again, as though the gravity of the bench was pulling the room back under his control. But something subtle was shifting. The spectators saw the fire in Thomas's rhetoric, but they also saw the composure in Cruise's restraint. The more the justice thundered, the more Tom's calm looked like strength. His silence wasn't weakness, it was patience, the patience of a man waiting for the right moment to strike. Reporters scribbled furiously, aware the air itself felt combustible. Each word from Thomas landed like a drumbeat of authority. But in between those beats was a growing suspense. When would Cruise finally answer? And what would he say? The nation held its breath. Social media feeds blazed with anticipation. Why isn't Cruise responding yet? He's biding his time. He's going to drop something huge. Thomas doesn't realize he's walking into it. The standoff reached its peak when Thomas, his voice dripping with finality, declared, "You are a guest in this chamber, Mr. Cruise, and like all guests, you will remember whose house this is." The gavel of arrogance had fallen. The justice reclined, assured he had silenced the interloper. The room buzzed with uneasy energy, half convinced the confrontation was over, half hoping it had only just begun. But just when Thomas believed he had silenced Cruise, everything flipped in a single devastating moment. The moment stretched thin, fragile as glass. Clarence Thomas reclined in his chair, convinced the gavel had fallen, that the room now bent once again to his authority. But Tom Cruise did not move like a man defeated. He sat forward, hands clasped, gaze fixed not with anger, but with clarity so sharp it pierced the silence. When he finally spoke, his voice was low, measured, so calm it demanded the ear. "You speak of this chamber as though it belongs to you," Tom began, his tone even, deliberate. "But this chamber, this court, this entire system, it doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people who trusted it would defend them." The words hit like a sudden crack of thunder. A murmur swept through the gallery, restrained but undeniable. Even the court reporters, trained to keep their composure, glanced up from their pads. Thomas's smirk faltered, just slightly. He shifted in his chair, straightening his robe as though adjusting fabric could restore his armor. "Careful, Mr. Cruise," he warned. But the weight in his voice lacked its earlier certainty. Tom pressed forward, his cadence building. "For decades, you've sat in silence while decisions stripped away protections, while power tilted further toward the few who already had everything. And when people asked for answers, you didn't speak. You hid. Behind your robe, behind your smirk, behind the privilege of untouchability. You call it restraint. The country calls it contempt." Gasps rippled through the room. Some spectators nodded instinctively. Others covered their mouths as though afraid that justice might actually lash out. Thomas opened his mouth to retort, but Tom did not give him the chance. He leaned in, his voice firmer now, no longer a quiet observation but a truth that burned. "You accuse me of spectacle, of playing to the cameras. But let's be honest, Justice Thomas, the cameras didn't come here for me. They came here because the nation is starved for accountability. They came here because every time a ruling favors the rich over the poor, every time a voice is dismissed, every time a scandal disappears into silence, the people lose more faith in the system you represent." The justice clenched his jaw. The smirk was gone now, replaced by a stillness that betrayed discomfort. His hand twitched against the armrest, his usual calm cracking in imperceptible ways only the sharpest eyes would catch. Tom paused, letting the silence do its work. Then, with surgical precision, he delivered the blow. "You say this is your house. But let me remind you, houses are built by workers, cleaned by workers, protected by workers. This chamber doesn't belong to you. It belongs to the people whose sweat, whose labor, whose lives make this country possible. And they're watching right now." The gallery erupted in a low chorus of gasps and murmurs, restrained by the bailiffs but impossible to suppress. The cameras zoomed in on Thomas's face, capturing the faint sheen of sweat at his temple. Tom did not gloat. He did not shout. He simply let the weight of his words press against the silence before continuing. "You've accepted gifts from billionaires while ruling on cases that determine their fortunes. You've preached humility while living a life shielded by wealth and privilege. You talk about history remembering its guests, but history remembers something else too. It remembers hypocrisy." At that word hypocrisy, the room seemed to collapse inward. A spectator stifled a sob. Another muttered, "That's right," under their breath. The stenographer's hands trembled, keys clicking in urgent rhythm to keep up. Thomas shifted again, this time leaning forward, his voice strained. "You tread dangerously close to disrespect." But Tom met his eyes, unwavering. "Respect is earned. Authority is only as legitimate as the trust it protects. And right now, millions no longer trust this institution because of you." The sentence landed like a verdict. For the first time in memory, Clarence Thomas looked small, not because he had lost his title or his robe, but because the armor of arrogance could no longer shield him from truths spoken plainly. Tom stepped back slightly, his voice softening into something almost tender. "I'm not here because I want power. I don't need your seat. I don't need your title. I'm here because people are tired of being told to sit down, shut up, and accept decisions handed down by men who've forgotten what struggle feels like." Tears welled in the eyes of a young woman in the gallery, her hand clutching the arm of the man beside her. A reporter later described the atmosphere as a collective exhale, as though the country had been waiting years to hear those words. Tom's crescendo was deliberate, almost orchestral. He leaned back, looked around the chamber, and then delivered the final strike. "You accuse me of spectacle? No. What's happening here is revelation. You are not untouchable. You are not above the people. And after today, you will never again sit in silence without the nation remembering that someone stood up and called you what you are. A servant who forgot who he serves." The room exploded. Gasps, sobs, scattered claps stifled quickly by bailiffs. The cameras caught it all, every tear, every trembling lip, every stunned expression that painted the chamber. Clarence Thomas, once so immovable, sat frozen. His jaw worked, but no words came. His smirk had vanished entirely, replaced by a hollow stillness that betrayed the magnitude of the blow. Tom didn't gloat. He didn't bask. He simply lowered his gaze for a moment, as though acknowledging the weight of what had just been unleashed. When he looked back up, his eyes burned not with triumph, but with resolve, the look of a man who hadn't spoken for himself, but for millions. The silence that followed was deafening. It wasn't the silence of dismissal anymore. It was the silence of realization, of history cracking open. And then the eruption began, not just in the room, but beyond. Phones lit up. Hashtags surged. Commentators scrambled. The confrontation had already leapt beyond the chamber walls, surging into the bloodstream of a nation that could no longer look away. The eruption that followed didn't just echo in the chamber, it swept across the entire nation. The instant Tom's words settled into silence, the courtroom fractured into chaos. A swell of gasps, sobs, and scattered claps rippled through the gallery before bailiffs could restore order. Some spectators buried their faces in their hands, overwhelmed by the release of years of unspoken frustration. Others sat upright, tears streaking down their cheeks, as though they had just witnessed something holy. Even those who tried to remain composed couldn't suppress the tremors in their breath. Thomas sat motionless, his face unreadable, but the damage was visible in every twitch of his jaw. The robe that once seemed invincible now looked like little more than fabric draped over a man exposed. For the first time, Clarence Thomas was not the silent power towering over proceedings. He was the subject of a reckoning he couldn't control. Outside, the eruption was immediate. Within seconds, clips of Cruz's words were spliced, subtitled, and uploaded across every platform. Twitter lit up like a lightning storm. Hashtag Cruz vs. Thomas shot to the #1 trend worldwide, followed closely by hashtag Truth on Trial and hashtag Servant Not Master. TikTok filled with quick edits of the confrontation, set to dramatic music, young creators mouthing along to Tom's closing line, "A servant who forgot who he serves." On Instagram, fan pages transformed into political pages overnight, sharing still shots of Tom's steady gaze, pairing them with captions like, "This is what courage looks like," and "Dignity has a face." Memes sprouted instantly. One showed Thomas's disappearing smirk captioned, "When arrogance meets reality." Another placed Cruz's words in bold white letters across an image of Lady Justice, scales tilted back into balance. Cable news scrambled to keep up. Anchors replayed the clip on loop, commentators interrupting one another in urgent tones. "We've never seen anything like this before. The veil has been ripped away. This isn't just a confrontation, it's a cultural earthquake." Celebrities piled on. Actors, musicians, athletes' voices that usually stayed silent on politics tweeted their support. One called it the speech of a generation. Another said, "For the first time in years, I feel proud watching someone speak truth to power." Politicians, too, seized the moment. Some praised Cruz as a necessary disruptor. Others tried to downplay the confrontation, but all recognized what the polls would later confirm: the nation was transfixed. For ordinary people, though, the impact ran deeper than hashtags and headlines. In diners, living rooms, classrooms, and buses, people replayed the moment not for entertainment, but for validation. Immigrant parents whispered to their children, "That's what dignity looks like." Workers shared the clip on lunch breaks, nodding at one another in quiet solidarity. Students passed it around as though it were a rallying cry. It wasn't just that Cruz had spoken, it was that he had said aloud what so many had carried silently: the belief that power had forgotten them. Editorials erupted the next morning. Some praised the confrontation as a civic intervention, others as a cultural reset. Even critics who dismissed Cruz as a celebrity out of his depth admitted the words had struck a nerve that no pundit, no politician, had managed to touch in years. And through it all, Clarence Thomas remained silent. No rebuttal, no press release, no carefully worded defense. His silence, once his greatest shield, now felt like confirmation. The longer he withheld a response, the louder Tom's words echoed, filling the vacuum with meaning Thomas could no longer control. The impact was seismic, not just because of what had been said, but because of how it reverberated. It felt like a collective unmasking, a moment where the distance between the powerful and the people shrank in real time. For once, truth wasn't filtered through think tanks or party spin, it was delivered raw, direct, undeniable. In the weeks that followed, surveys showed a sharp drop in public trust in the Supreme Court. Commentators debated whether one moment could alter an institution's reputation, but the numbers told their own story. More important than statistics, however, was the emotional current now flowing through the country, a sense that someone had finally stood up, and in doing so, had reminded millions of their own voices. The eruption had spread far beyond the chamber. It was no longer just about Clarence Thomas or Tom Cruise. It was about the idea that arrogance could be confronted, that silence could be broken, that even the most untouchable could be made to answer. But beyond the noise of memes and headlines lay a deeper lesson, one America desperately needed to hear. When the storm of applause and outrage finally began to settle, Tom Cruise did not bask in it. He did not raise his arms in triumph, nor did he let the fire of the moment consume him. Instead, he spoke again, this time softer, steadier, as though speaking not to Clarence Thomas, not even to the courtroom, but to the country itself. He reminded everyone why he was there, not to win a war of words, not to humiliate, but to illuminate. "This isn't about me," he said, his voice carrying with unforced conviction. "It isn't even about one man on this bench. It's about what kind of nation we want to be. Do we bow to arrogance and corruption, or do we insist on integrity, no matter how high the pedestal of power?" The gallery leaned in. The tone had shifted from confrontation to communion. His words began to rise above the courtroom walls, reaching into living rooms and classrooms, into the hearts of people who had felt for too long that truth was powerless against institutions. Tom spoke of dignity, of the simple but radical belief that service meant remembering the people you served. He drew parallels to the everyday struggles of millions: the immigrant who worked 2 jobs while being told they didn't belong, the young student who carried the weight of discrimination but still dreamed of becoming more, the parent who sacrificed so their children could stand taller than they had. "Their stories," he said, "are what make America, not the marble of these halls, not the titles stitched into robes, but the lives lived in quiet sacrifice and unshakable courage." The power of his words was not in their theatricality, but in their truth. For a man who had spent his life perfecting roles on screen, the moment felt utterly unscripted, raw in its sincerity. He gave the nation permission to see itself not in the shadow of institutions, but in the reflection of its own collective dignity. Thomas sat stone-faced, but the room around him pulsed with energy that no gavel could contain. It was no longer about him, it was about the contrast he embodied. Arrogance versus humility, power versus service, silence versus courage. And in that contrast, America was offered a choice. Cruz framed it plainly. "We cannot afford to mistake power for wisdom, or silence for integrity. What holds this country together isn't fear, it isn't deference, it's the courage of ordinary people demanding honesty from those who claim to lead them." Some in the gallery wiped tears, others simply nodded, as though hearing words they had been waiting for all their lives. The speech was not an attack, it was a call to remembrance, a call back to the ideals so many felt slipping away. In the days to come, commentators would argue about the politics of it, whether it was a turning point or just another flash in the pan. But for the people who heard him in that moment, none of that mattered. What mattered was the resonance, the reminder that truth, even when spoken by an unlikely messenger, could still cut through noise and cynicism. Tom's final words were not thunderous, but they landed with the weight of history. "Dignity is not negotiable. Courage is not optional. Integrity is not a performance, it's a duty. And the question before us is simple. Will we live by those values, or will we watch them die in silence?" The courtroom sat in reverent quiet, as though unwilling to breathe too loudly and disturb the gravity of what had just been spoken. Beyond those walls, millions watched and replayed his words, some whispering them aloud to themselves like a vow. And as the echoes of that moment lingered, one question remained: will we choose spectacle, or will we choose truth? And so, the moment that began with a smirk ended with a silence that shook the chamber. Clarence Thomas, once untouchable, sat diminished. Tom Cruise, long dismissed as merely an actor, stood as a vessel of truth. It wasn't a Hollywood spectacle, it was raw, undeniable dignity colliding head-on with arrogance. That clash is why this moment matters, because what unfolded in that courtroom wasn't just a celebrity taking on a justice. It was a reminder etched into the memory of everyone watching that power without integrity cannot stand forever, and that courage, even when unexpected, can ignite a nation. Think about what we witnessed: a Supreme Court justice faltering under the weight of his own contradictions, while a man with nothing to gain spoke words that gave voice to millions. That is why this story has exploded across America, why hashtags trend, why headlines blare, why conversations echo in every corner of the country. But this can't end here. If Tom's words moved you, if you felt that fire in your chest, that swell of recognition that truth still has a voice, then you are part of this moment too. Share this story, tell it again and again. Let it ripple outward until no one forgets what dignity sounds like. And if you believe, as we do, that arrogance must never silence honesty, that America is strongest when its people demand integrity, then join us. Subscribe, add your voice, and be part of this growing movement. Because history isn't written only in marble